Hi, and welcome to Fintech Snacks, a series that looks at common fintech use cases and how to solve for them. My name is Paul Underwood. I lead the Industry Blueprints team at AWS, and today I'm going to be talking about the Fintech Blueprint, a new quick start available on AWS. The Fintech Blueprint is essentially at its core infrastructure as code, which means we provide a bit of code that when you deploy it will spin up a whole bunch of infrastructure for you in less than about 15 minutes. It creates the foundations for networking, compliance, and security. Now, what the analogy I like to make is a the blueprint. If you were responsible and told to go build a facility in real life, you would need to think about pouring foundations and running electrical and plumbing and building the rooms and a room for reception where people are allowed in, and more secure rooms where you keep sensitive resources that maybe require badge access. If you extend that analogy to the cloud, you're trying to build a building in the cloud. You need these foundational plumbing and electrical, so to speak, for networking and compliance and security. But how to go about building that isn't really, distinguishing for your company. Every company has these needs, and what the blueprint does is sort of build these foundations for you and leaves you with a building where you can start to move in or sort of furnish the rooms with your own compute resources, storage resources you need to solve for your product or service. And because it's infrastructure as code, it can be deployed on day one, and positions you, kind of accelerates you past the heavy lifting of setting up all of this infrastructure and into a place where you can really start to build product or your service on AWS really right away. So is the FinTech Blueprint really right for you? The answer will vary, although, here are some common things that I look for when recommending the FinTech Blueprint to startups. First, if you know you need to solve for security and compliance today, and you want to start thinking ahead and solving for that now, the FinTech Blueprint is really great. If you're just starting out on AWS and you don't really know how some of our core fundamentals like VPCs and subnets and routing tables and things like all that, how it all fits together, this is a really great way to just kind of skip past some of that and know you're building in sort of baseline best practices right off the gate. Or if you're already using AWS to some degree, but things are starting to feel a little bit like the Wild West, you've got, you're still maybe using default VPCs and default subnets, and you're starting to, potentially realize that, security might be taking a back seat to progress, and you'd like to align some more structure. The blueprint's a really great way to either start out or begin to, applying some structure and rigor to your infrastructure. And the blueprint was really built with startups in mind. We all too often saw startups either just straight up struggling with the vast amount of service features available on AWS and not knowing how to sort of stitch it all together the right way. And we've kind of done that for you and done it in code so that you can replicate it very easily. Or we would see customers go out to consultants and things like that who would go out and pay hefty consulting fees to go stand some of these environments up. We really feel like that your startups' dollars are best spent focusing on features and not undifferentiated heavy lifting. And so that's a big part of the spirit of why we built this, is for startups in mind to just kind of skip past or kind of accelerate beyond that struggle. One of the common questions we get is what makes the blueprint fintech specific, and there's really two answers to that. So when you deploy the blueprint, one of the things that includes is the Fintech Blueprint Service Catalog. And Service Catalog is a service of ours where we can package up, or you can package up, additional infrastructure as code that can be readily deployed from your account when you're ready. Today, we include a digital payment solution via the Swift Digital Connectivity Quick Start. That's an option we very much intend in the near future to include more and more solutions for different subverticals within fintech, insurtech, regulatory, regtech, that kind of thing. Today we've got that Swift Digital Connectivity Quick Start. And from a compliance capability perspective, the AWS Conformance Packs, which we'll talk a little bit more about here in a minute, are available to you, and the one that we're including is, like, for example, the PCI DSS 3, and as well as some region restriction capabilities. And we'll talk more about that when we get to the compliance section. What are some of the core networking capabilities that the Blueprint stands up for you? What are the things that you can really take advantage of? Well, every company that's using the cloud really is going to need a VPN in that cloud. That's going to provide the encrypted access to your internal sites that you might host that maybe just your employees should be able to access. If you've got compute hosts like data science environments or just servers that you want to connect to and install things on, you'll need a way of accessing those private resources. The same goes for your databases or data warehouses. You'll want a VPN usually to connect into those things. You'll want to have a private DNS, so the ability to instead of having to remember IP addresses, having your own sort of private top and second and third level domain names, however you may choose, gives you sort of advanced capability of additional routing as well as namespace and capabilities. And a core element of the AWS network is the ability to architect for high availability. And so the Blueprint distributes its network across 2 physical data centers in the region that you deploy it on. And when we get to the network diagram, you'll see that illustrated. But the availability zone feature of the Blueprint is a key aspect to be able to run and maintain the sort of a minimum high availability architecture on AWS. So that's why we have 2 availability zones available to you after you deploy. The second is the AWS Config Conformance Pack. This is for the core compliance capabilities that the Blueprint stands up for you. AWS Config is a service that sort of is continually monitoring services that you have already launched in the past or that you launch in the future. We deploy a number of conformance packs that look at IAM, which is our identity access and management, so effectively your security configurations at a sort of AWS control plane level. S3, common storage appliance that's used heavily, and so we've got best practices wrapped around that. We've got best practices also wrapped around sort of NIST for cybersecurity minimum, some detective guardrails, which are really just a number of AWS best practices packaged up in a really interesting way, and as well as that PCI DSS conformance pack. Some of these, to give us some examples of what these conformance packs do, in the event that you launch an EC2 instance into a public subnet, for example, that is unintentional, right? It's really rare that an EC2 instance should be in a public subnet. Typically, it's just load balancers that should be there. But in the event that you do and it has a public IP address, the AWS Conformance Pack will alert you and tell you, hey, you just launched an insecure host with this is the ID of that host, and here's the reason why. If you launch an S3 bucket and it's insecure because the bucket policy is too open, these conformance packs will alert you and alarm when that happens. Some of these checks actually will be able to auto-remediate some of the issues that they detect over time. You'll actually see an example of that in the demo that we get to here in a moment. But another thing that's also worth mentioning is for these different, especially control regime specific conformance packs like NIST and PCI, we actually include in our documentation specific control ID mappings to those frameworks. So when you're filling out checklists for partners or corporate enterprises that you work with, in terms of what compliance and security you're working on, those control mappings can be really friendly and make it a lot easier for you to say, yes, we're looking at PCI compliance in these respects. And here's our conformance pack mapping to that. And then another feature that we recently added is the ability to lock down IAM actions to specific regions. So if you, for example, only wanted to allow your IAM users and companies to do things inside of the Frankfurt region, you could restrict IAM to only allow actions inside US Central 1. Or multiple regions if you wanted to allow US East 1 and US West 2 only. That's an option available to you as well. From a security perspective, the core capabilities that the Blueprint provides are sort of a properly configured set of VPCs for production, management, and development phases of your software development lifecycle. As as everyone should know, that it's best practices to really isolate and keep separate, your production and your development resources at a minimum. And so there are two VPCs that actually aren't allowed to communicate with each other, and we'll go into that in some of the demo here soon. But having those VPCs properly properly isolated from each other is really a core best practice that everybody should follow. Within those VPCs, there are different subnets to serve public, private, and isolated resources to kind of keep that building analogy going. Right, your reception area is sort of public. You want to allow people to come in, potentially to talk to people, but you're going to have private and very secure rooms behind that you need to have. And the Blueprint does the same, sort of standing up those sort of segmented rooms for you. And then finally, the config packs, which we already touched on a little bit. The operational best practices for IAM config pack is really the most important one, and one that you should go look at immediately, especially if you've been using AWS to some degree already. It's going to automatically scan all of your IAM users, IAM roles, and really alert and alarm when you're not following best practices there. For example, an IAM user has a key that hasn't been rotated in a long time. This thing will alert you to that fact and hopefully encourage you to consider using an IAM role instead. Putting it all together, what do we get here? We get our three VPCs that we talked about just a moment ago: production, development, and our management VPC. We get peering connections between them, as well as to make sure that the management VPC can communicate. But you'll see there's no way for the development and production VPC to talk to each other. We see our segmented subnets. We've got our sort of waiting rooms, so to speak, or reception areas, so to speak, our public subnets. We've got our private subnets and our really protected, locked down, isolated subnets here at the bottom for our databases and sensitive resources. In our management subnet, we have our VPN endpoint, which is what our employees, developers, internal users will connect to. Once they're connected to that VPN, it's just like they're on the same network as all the resources in the cloud here, and they can access private internal sites or internal data warehouses. Or your developers can access their EC2 hosts to debug things. That's all available to them there. Kind of pictured at the bottom, we've got the AWS Service Catalog. That is what the fintech subvertical solutions like the Swift Digital Payments Quick Start will be made available through. Route 53 handles our internal DNS, and AWS Config is where those conformance packs are all contained. And in the demo, I'll be actually walking you through all those things specifically. So over time, what does this look like? Once this is spun up for you, and the Blueprint spins all this up in about 15 minutes, and there's a lot here pictured that, route tables and network ACLs and things like that really saving you a lot of effort trying to spin up. But once all these things are up, what do you do with it? We go into some pretty concrete examples in the demo of what to do. For example, spinning up a data science environment for the first time, what that might look like. But over time down the road, it will end up looking something like this. You may end up having internally facing application load balancers in your public subnets, or production publicly facing load balancers in that reception area. You'll probably have a number of different application servers kind of spanning across your subnets, supporting different microservices or features in your application. And you'll have your database servers and your data warehouses and things to that effect deployed inside your isolated subnets. Likely your CI/CD and DevOps tooling, as that comes online and as you need it, is probably best deployed in the management VPC so that it can write and deploy into both environments. So just to kind of give you a picture of once you have some more meat on the bone, what some of your resources might look like. But without further ado, we're going to hop over and actually deploy this in the console so you can get a sense of what that deployment experience looks like. Again, just check out that link in the description below, and it should take you straight to the deployment guide so that you can follow along. All right, now we're going to actually deploy the blueprint. What you'll want to do to find the deployment guide is essentially, use your favorite search engine, search AWS Fintech Blueprint. Top link should send you to this page here. You've got the deployment diagram as well as a couple of orange links. Go ahead and click the one of these orange links to actually view the deployment guide. You'll kind of see the standard overview conversation. A lot of this we've already touched on today. Here's that architecture diagram that we just went over. And by the end of sort of this section of the video, we'll be kind of covering, we'll actually show what it looks like to connect to the VPN, connect over the peering connection to, a private, application server using our own private DNS capabilities with Route 53, just like you would, sort of pretend like we're launching a server for you to start developing, product or service on. And then we'll also take a look at, I'll show you where the, Swift digital connectivity quick start is available through the AWS service catalog, as well as some of the AWS config rules that are set up for the compliance. We'll touch on all that over the next 30 minutes or so. The one thing that I will mention is really the resource quotas. So every AWS account has a limit at the outset of the number of resources that you can launch. It's everything from number of servers of different types to number of elastic IP addresses that are available to your account. If you're using a brand new account, fresh account, there really isn't anything you need to worry about. The blueprint doesn't exceed any of those limits. It's really easy to submit a service quota increase, and there's instructions on how to do that up here. You'll likely, if you are going to bump into a resource limit issue, it's usually because you've maybe used AWS, you've already have some AWS usage, and your account's very new, and the limits haven't had time to automatically grow, which they do automatically grow over time. But if you're relatively fresh and you've still used some resources, you may bump into likely an elastic IP address. For the customers that do bump into resource issues, 9 times out of 10, it's usually because they don't have enough elastic IPs. So if you have a relatively fresh account and you've launched, a handful of resources, just double check in the EC2 console what your elastic IP address limit is, and just make sure you have at least 3. But for the most part, it's very rare that people exceed any of the other requirements. So kind of jumping straight into the deployment steps in the guide, the first thing that you'll want to do is install the AWS CDK and TypeScript. There's a link here for some of the prerequisites required to install the AWS CDK. Probably the heaviest of which is making sure you have the AWS CLI installed and properly configured. Again, the prereq section has links for on getting that done. But there's also some shortcuts to launching and using environments that have the AWS CLI cover command line interface pre-installed. Our Cloud 9, which is kind of a managed development environment, has it, as well as our Cloud Shell service. And so the link to Cloud Shell is this little icon right here. You can also type it in the search bar, but it's real handy. You can just click on this, and this is just going to bring up a web-based shell environment that has the AWS command line environment pre-installed and is really ready and raring to go to install everything that we need. It's got a lot of the prereqs. We still need to install the types of the AWS CDK and TypeScript. And Cloud Shell, you'll want to add sudo to the front of that to make sure it installs or has permissions to install those packages. Once that's done, we'll have the AWS CDK installed. And the easiest way to just check that that's installed properly is do CDK version, and it looks like we're all good. And so the next thing that we'll want to do is actually run the command to bootstrap the environment. Bootstrapping is something that you'll only need to do one time per account per region. And so we're going to bootstrap the CDK inside the Oregon region right now. So if you bear with me, I'm going to put together the bootstrap command. So this is the multi-line paste here for Cloud Shell. What we'll want to do is actually edit this and put in our own account ID here. So 748 and then the region that we're deploying this in. So we're doing this in Oregon, which is US West 2. And we'll paste that in. And this is going to start bootstrapping the CDK in this environment. The purpose of the bootstrapping is it creates a number of resources in this environment that lets the CDK effectively manage all of the different CDK stacks that you end up deploying into the environment. You'll see it's creating a bucket right now that's used to store assets. It's creating some roles for some more sophisticated CI/CD processes as you need them. But a lot of this is really kind of future proofing. We're not going to be taking advantage of all the features of the CDK bootstrap. But again, it's just something you have to do one time per region. And you probably won't think about it again for a while once this completes. So once this is bootstrapped, we're actually going to go ahead and clone the blueprint and start deploying resources. So this is about complete. There we go. And the next thing that we need to do is we've bootstrapped is actually clone the environment. And so I'll grab our clone command. And we'll change directory into our Quick Start environment, our Blueprint Quick Start, and then we'll just run a quick npm install, and that's going to install all the packages that the Blueprint needs from npm, including a bunch of the AWS CDK repos, as you can see it installing now. Once that's done, we just ran once our install is complete, we'll actually run two commands back to back, the npm run build, which will sort of build the actual TypeScript application and stack, and then secondly, the CDK deploy command, which will actually tell the CDK to go deploy the blueprint into our environment. So as this wraps up, we'll run our run build and CDK deploy command. And it's off to the races. So the CDK deploy is, you'll want to run npm run build and CDK deploy back to back, usually in pairs, because oftentimes when you make changes to the TypeScript application itself to say extend the blueprint for your own purposes, or there's changes you'd like to make, you need to compile those, sort of build those changes, and then CDK deploy right afterwards, which will deploy it. The CDK command has other things like the CDK diff, which will actually, before it deploys any changes, will show you any changes that it's about to make, and has other benefits, like in the deploy command here, it's showing you all the different IAM changes that it's going to make, just to really bring kind of security to the top of the awareness. You can kind of see here creating IAM roles and permissions to the VPN certificate and Amazon Certificate Manager that we'll be using in the VPN later. So it'll ask you to confirm that you're comfortable deploying these changes. Hit Y and yes, and this will actually start deploying the application or the blueprint into the environment. And the way that the CDK works is it's really kind of an abstraction layer on top of the extremely powerful CloudFormation uh, service on top of AWS, which is all infrastructure as code, and we'll get into some of that here in a moment. Um, but it's effectively standing up a bunch of resources on our behalf. In fact, if we go look at in the AWS console, if we go to CloudFormation, we'll see the CDK doing its magic. Um, here, this CDK toolkit stack is actually the Bootstrap stack. When we ran that Bootstrap command that one time, this gets deployed and will likely never change, and you'll never see it update for a long time until the CDK itself is updated. And then here we have the Fintech Blueprint itself, and we'll see other stacks get created here shortly. But if we drill into the Fintech Blueprint, I'll zoom out and make it a little easier to see. We can see all of if we go to the Resources tab, we'll be able to see all the different resources that it's creating. Here you can see log groups and roles and bucket policies, route tables, elastic IPs, all the necessary guts and unnecessary sort of undifferentiated heavy lifting that the blueprint is saving you is kind of captured in this list of resources. All the route tables and subnet associations and the VPN and all that complexity is really abstracted away from you. And this is really the best view of seeing everything that the blueprint is saving you from having to set up. And so I want to zoom in on a couple of key resources that the blueprint is creating for you. And so even though it's only been running for effectively 2 minutes, there's still it's really creating these resources very, very quickly. And we can actually already go ahead and take a look at some of the key resources that you need to think about as you're you know building your company on AWS in these early days. So the first thing we want to look at that I want to show you is a map of our primary blocks that we saw earlier in our deployment guide. I want to show you where they live right off the bat. So you have your production VPC, your management VPC, and your development VPC. Any resources you launch, be it an EC2 instance or a volume for storage or a database, is going to live in one of these green or blue boxes. But these green and blue boxes, these subnets themselves, have to live in a development VPC. And so when you're thinking, it's time for me to launch a server, you need to ask yourself a couple of questions. Is this a server for development purpose or testing purposes, or is this a production server? If it's a production environment, you'll want to deploy in one. You'll want to make sure you're deploying in the production VPC, and then obviously development goes in the development. As far as what subnet you're deploying things into, if it needs to be public facing, which is generally should just be load balancers, but can be EC2 instances, they would go inside the public subnets. If they are private resources, meaning they should really only be addressable by resources inside of your cloud or through the VPN, you'd want to choose the private subnet. If it's really sensitive resource, typically things like your databases, you'll want to choose the isolated subnets that don't allow egress outside of AWS and the VPN at all. They don't allow any outbound internet connection, is what makes these isolated subnets. That's where you'll want to deploy those. So what I first want to do is, and really you'll go through this exercise for everything you launch in AWS anytime you're instantiating any kind of compute resource. What's the nature of the application I'm developing, and where does that belong from an isolation and security perspective? And really, every time you launch a resource, you're going to have to answer those two questions. And we'll show you guys an example of that here in just a second. So what I first want to do, though, is show you our VPC list that have been created in the last 3-4 minutes. So if I go to the VPC section of the console, look for VPCs. Once this loads, you'll see we have our 4 VPCs. You'll see 4 VPCs listed here. These ones you should expect to see are development, management, and production. We kind of already know what they do. But you'll see this 4th VPC with a hyphen. This is called the default VPC. This has been around for a long time. You'll see it's marked as the default VPC here. If you've already using resources and you happen to have already deployed things into this sort of default VPC, you'll want to start migrating those things, those resources into these new VPCs. This VPC, this default VPC, is a common mistake startups use. The subnets inside of it are all public subnets, and so any resources you launch in there generally are addressable to the internet. And so I strongly encourage, especially in fresh, brand new accounts, to delete this VPC so that nobody at your company makes the mistake of using it. I strongly encourage you to do that. If you already made the mistake and you're already using the default VPC, go ahead and move those resources into or shut down resources you're not using, but move the ones that you do need into the development VPC most likely, and then delete the default VPC. It's not really beneficial to keep around, and go ahead and remove that. So you can see our VPCs listed here. Another view, so that's our high level boxes. To look at those sort of green and blue boxes, the public and private subnets, we can look at the subnet page here. And so the subnets, if we kind of list it by name, you'll see our development VPC application subnet here lives here. Our database subnet lives here. Our DMZ subnet is here. And so you'll kind of see all the different subnets that have already been created for you, and all the routing and VPN connectivity to these subnets has already been pre-established, so you don't need to sweat it. You just need to think about where to deploy your resource once it's available. And so we'll go ahead and, as this is deploying, we'll go ahead and create an instance in one of these application subnets, so that we can connect to it later over the VPN, just as an example. So, effectively, let's pretend that we want to launch a new server, really just to do some, maybe early data science on, or start developing a web service for, really any purpose that you might need. We'll go ahead and just sort of launch a generic instance. Again, whether you're launching a database or an EC2 instance, you'll need to answer the questions as to what VPC and subnet you want to be launching things in, for you to actually, before AWS will launch anything for you. So first things first, we'll kind of launch our just generic example host. First thing, I'm just going to choose the Amazon Linux 2 sort of AMI or Amazon machine image. There's lots of other machine images, including Windows and Ubuntu and others that you can choose as well. Here's where we choose instance size. Just for example purposes, I'm just going to choose the T2 small. It's cheap, it's quick. Next, we'll configure instance details. And this is where we really start getting into the meat. So let's say we're launching this sort of development data science environment where we're going to start doing some analysis on trading volumes or something to that effect. The first thing that we'll want to specify is what network this belongs to. And here you'll see it says default. This is that default VPC, problem default VPC, one that you've hopefully delete. As the default, it sets up as the default, but we don't want to use that. We're launching a development data science environment, so we'll choose our development VPC. Now, on the subnet, we have to decide what we want. This isn't meant to be a publicly facing host. This isn't a load balancer, so we don't want to use the DMZ subnets. It's not a database, obviously, and so we just want to pick one of the application subnets. Which subnet really doesn't matter. They have this which app subnet we use doesn't matter. They have the same routing rules. They're just in different physical data centers, and so we have two subnets for high availability purposes. But if we're just launching one box, we can just pick one of the app subnets. Doesn't really matter, and we're in business. So we'll go ahead and leave all the rest the same. We'll, next tab lets us add additional storage. We're just doing a demo here, so we'll just leave it as the generic. We'll go ahead and create a security group here. We'll just kind of blast through and make it available. You'll see here that by default there is it automatically sets up a security group to 0.0.0.0. So it sets up SSH on port range 22 to the internet at large. We don't want to do that, right? Because we're launching our host inside of a private VPC in a private subnet, it won't be addressable to the internet at large by virtue of the network ACL rules that are applied to the application subnet. So even if we left it at 0, we'd still be protected. But if somebody made a mistake and attached this to a public subnet, well, if it had a public IP address, it would be addressable, and the security group would make SSH available to the internet at large. We don't want to do that. So the other option that we can that the Blueprint provides is we create a VPN user security group. And so in this case, we want to allow VPN users to access this data science environment to run their work in the cloud. And so we can just reuse this VPN user security group. And this will only allow folks who are connected to the VPN to actually connect on port 22. And the next, so even though you can leave it at 0.0.0 and you're still somewhat protected, it's best if you can use that security group. Give as limited permissions as possible. Ideally, especially if it's a VPN, either use the VPN user security group or use that security group. It's just a confirmation page. I'm going to go ahead and just create a new queue pair as an example. And we're going to use this key pair to connect to this host once we're on the VPN. All right, there we go. So go ahead and just download that key pair, and we'll launch our box. All right, so our host is launching, and we'll come back to that later once we get to the VPN. But while that's happening, let's go ahead and go back to our command line environment here, and we'll see how our deployment's faring. Looks like it's moving along smoothly, and it's all done. So in the amount of time it took me to show you the network, it went ahead and finished creating everything else. So kind of the post-deployment steps, once it's complete, is the first step is really just connecting to the VPN. And from an isolation perspective, we really separate or make it effectively impossible for the production VPC to route to resources in the development VPC. There is no peering connection allowed there. We do allow folks that are connected to the VPN to route into the production or the development VPC to access internal websites that might have been developed here, or SSH into servers, or connect to a database that you might have running inside of this, or a data warehouse. That can all be done, but you'll need to be on the VPN to do that, or have a resource in the cloud already doing so. So the first step is downloading the client VPN file for that you'll want to distribute to folks that are connecting to the VPN. So you can do that by going back to the VPC console. That's where the most of our networking capability is you can control most of your networking capabilities inside the VPC console, including the client VPN endpoints, which you'll see here on the left side. And you'll see our endpoint created right here for us. And so all we need to do to be able to start taking advantage of this is just check the box and hit this blue download client configuration button. This is going to download an OVPN file for those of you who have used OpenVPN in the past. That is an option. You can import that. We also have our own managed VPN service that you can use. That is or managed VPN client VPN tool. It's called AWS VPN client. There's some links down here to do that, to install those. But before we actually connect, we need to add the certificates that were created as part of the blueprint and into our Open VPN config file that was just downloaded. So if I'm just quickly going to open up our config editor or our Open VPN file that was just created. What we want to do is add in our section to include our configuration section to include the keys. And so that involves, and I'm just copying this straight out of the deployment guide here, but basically that involves kind of adding the cert and key section into the config file, and then we're going to copy and paste the actual contents of the certificate and key in here. And so I'm going to pop back over to our environment, and the way that you actually get that certificate and key is inside of it's actually the key and certificate are inside of an S3 bucket. So the name of the bucket will include the word Fintech Blueprint, VPN bucket. And so the Fintech bucket is right here. You'll see Fintech Blueprint Client VPN config bucket. And you'll see here a CRT or certificate and a key file here. So you'll want to check the box, hit download, and then you'll want to do the same on the next one. It's tempting to check both boxes and click download, although unfortunately it doesn't quite work that well. And so what I'm literally going to do is open up these two files that just got downloaded. So now that I've got the client VPN config file downloaded, and I've also downloaded the certificate and the key file, all I need to do is literally copy and paste the raw contents of the certificate into the certificate section and the key into the key section. So I'm just grabbing everything out of the certificate file and slapping it into the certificate section. I'm then grabbing everything out of the key file and slapping it inside the key section. And just like that, I have created my client VPN config file, and you can start, sort of distributing this file to the folks that need to connect to the VPN, this OVPN file, and it'll have everything they need to connect. All right, now that we've got our certificate and our key copied into the cert and key section down below, this file is just about ready to import into just about any OpenVPN compliant client tool. there may be an additional step, and you'll see this documented in the deployment guide about potentially adding a number of random characters in front of this VPN line here. Certain operating systems, certain VPN clients don't actually respect this random hostname value, in which case you need to just kind of manually add that in there. My preferred tool, which is the client VPN, or sort of the Open VPN client tool, is one of those tools that requires you to add those extra few letters. So just if that's the case, just slap those in there, and you're ready to import this file. And so with using the Open VPN tool, all I really need to do to start working or to connect is literally just drag and drop my VPN file, OVPN file, into this spot. And then I'll hit this connect after import. I can give it a name if I want. We'll just call it Fintech Blueprint. And then hit add. It takes about 30 seconds, and we'll see this get connected. Now, this is a major point here, it's kind of turning point and purpose of the blueprint here, is that by connecting to this VPN, you're effectively, connected to your data center in the cloud, right? Those EC2 instances that you're launching and those private subnets are now accessible only to you by virtue of you being on this VPN. And so to kind of follow up that example that we were using earlier, sort of that pretend data science environment that we launched earlier, let's pretend like we're going to connect to that and start, getting something done. So if I go back into our EC2 dashboard, we'll see our instance is now up and running and doing its thing. And what we're going to do is just SSH into that box, using our, over our VPN, doing it securely, and we'll be able to, from there we could install install whatever we like. So the first thing that we'll need to do here, and first thing that I want to emphasize, is you'll notice that there is no public IP address for this server listed here. This is the one we launched earlier. There's only a private IP address, and so typically, because of this, this is just one example of why this box is not, publicly addressable and it's secure and safe to access. From here we can see some of the security groups that we applied to it earlier, which basically only allow inbound access to VPN users. And so I'm going to go ahead and grab our private IP address, and we'll start to SSH into this box. All right, so let's go ahead and pop open my local machine here. And so this command prompt that you see here, this is my local development machine on my own laptop. And I'm going to SSH into that private server that we see behind us here. The first thing that we'll want to do is earlier when we launched this box, we created an SSH key that we associated with the host on launch so that we could crack into it once it was available. That key is here, so just want to make sure you chmod that to 600 so that the SSH agent can take advantage of it. And to SSH in the box, you just do SSH -I, which tells it to use a key pair for authentication. Put in the Fintech Blueprint key. The default user for using the Amazon Linux AMI is EC2-user, and then we'll put in our private IP address of our box that we just launched. I guess I'll do it manually here, which is 10.60.6.70. And so you'll see right away it's given us the classic, are you sure you want to continue? Just type in yes. And there we are. We are on our private box in the cloud. And the world's your oyster from here. Install your own tools, start moving stuff off your personal laptop into the cloud, launch, extremely large boxes for heavy computation, or take advantage of our launch clusters of machines to do things in a distributed way. It's really all up to you at this point, and you can do so knowing that you're operating in a secure environment that's all happening over VPN. So that's how we kind of launched that private host and connect to it. The next couple things that I'm going to go over are a little more about some of the AWS config and additional features, and as well as DNS. And so we'll actually come back to this and show how we're able to SSH into the hosts using our own private host names instead of having to rely on IP addresses. So let's pop back over to our the AWS console, and first I want to go over some of the AWS config pieces that have been created for you, because now that you know how to deploy the instances into the right place and how to connect to them over VPN, over SSH, you could just as easily launch web servers, databases, and connect to them. But as you start to launch those things, you may worry that people or you yourself are launching things the wrong way, or in ways that perhaps you make a mistake and did deploy something in the default VPC and you forgot to delete it, or you deploy something in the public subnet on accident. You still want to be notified when those things happen. And the way that we've done that, the way that we've solved for that and created a baseline for you for compliance is with AWS config. And if we pop into config, the kind of all the necessary basics in terms of config recorders, etc., were all created for you automatically by the blueprint, as well as a number of conformance packs. If we look at some of the ones that are available that are deployed right now, you can just go straight to conformance packs, and it's going to tell you all the ones that are deployed. Currently right now, the ones that are deployed are the control tower detective guardrails, best practices for S3, best practices for IAM, the PCI DSS operational best practices, as well as the NIST framework. You may not be PCI or have PCI requirements yourself, but this is a really handy, all of these have really great practices baked into them. And so let's just pick on the PCI one as just for example, that are really useful for any company that's looking to, maintain a high quality security standard on AWS. So some of the first things that like the PCI ones look at, for example, and there's over 50 different compliance rules just for this particular one. But this is going to be looking for things like automatically looking for EC2 instances launched with no public IP. And so in the event that a box does get launched in the default subnet by accident or in a public subnet, this check will actually alarm, flip to non-compliant, and you can set up alarms and alerts to send you notifications when that happens. You'll even find that some of these checks are actually able to automatically remediate issues whenever they are issues with resources when they're found. Not all checks do that, but you would see that you would see the option to enable auto remediation, like in this example here. This will automatically encrypt. Will automatically encrypt the volume that we launched for that data science piece earlier that wasn't encrypted. It would automatically remediate that for you, which is pretty slick. So take advantage of these config rules and these conformance packs. Make sure that you sign up to get notified, or integrate these things with your. When the time is right, you can integrate these things with your response tools. But there's a lot of gold and a lot of best practices baked into these conformance packs that you really you should really take advantage of. And there's new conformance packs coming out all the time, and I'd encourage you. While we gave you these 5 to begin with, check out the deploy conformance packs and some of the sample templates here, and see if there's any operational or control regimes that are pertinent to you that you might want to take advantage of. There are some based on industry, based on geo. You can see it's a pretty long list here, all well documented in GitHub and really easy and simple to deploy. The other feature of the Fintech Blueprint that I like to touch on is the service catalog. Right now we only package up a payment solution into the service catalog. It's the Swift payment, the Swift's connectivity payments quick start. You'll see here the Fintech Blueprint software catalog. The customers or you yourself can come in and basically deploy this Swift connectivity quick start that sort of puts you on the Swift payments network by coming into the service catalog, going to products, and choosing deploy. Makes it fairly straightforward to deploy. Check out the Swift client connectivity quick start on its own to learn more about that. But we've packaged up this product, and we'll be adding more products over time as the blueprint grows. All right, and so the last thing that I really want to touch on is some of that private DNS capability. If you go to Route 53, you'll see that the blueprint automatically created a private hosted zone that is associated with the production and development VPCs as well as the VPN clients at the same time. And so what this means is it's a common DNS service between all of your networks. So those who are connected to the VPN as well as resources that are in the cloud can have a single and similar use the same DNS settings basically. And this makes it really easy so that, like I mentioned before, you don't have to remember IP addresses every time you want to connect to something. So in this case, we create a really basic high level like corp top level domain. This is very readily changeable. The deployment guide talks about how to change the code, the blueprint code to update this to be really any top level or second and top level domain that you choose. We just made a standard generalized corp. But what you can do here is I can start creating records for let's say subdomains. Let's say for example, let's call it data science. We'll just call it datasci.corp, and this will be that sort of tie that data science instance that we connected to earlier. And so if I look at our host, we'll grab our IP address back. It was 10.60.6.70. So we can put in our private host here. We'll create a record. And just like that, I can now reference datasci.corp for anybody who's connected to the VPN or within the cloud, that will tie them directly to this, our private IP address over there. To kind of illustrate that point, we'll pop back over to our local development machine. And instead of connecting over the IP address, we could now connect over our datasci.corp. And we're still able to get into that box, no problem. And so no longer do I have to remember IP addresses. And this is really substantial, especially when you start running internal websites, internal corporate websites. It's just for maybe your employees. You can start creating records in Route 53, like we just did, to point to load balancers that host internal websites or to databases, so that people aren't typing in IP addresses, and also gives you the ability to redirect and change underlying IP addresses when you need to upgrade or things to that effect. All right, everybody. My name is Paul Underwood. It's been really great walking everybody through the Fintech Blueprint. Don't hesitate to reach out to your account managers or through the Fintech Blueprint GitHub issues and comments section. Happy to interact with you guys there. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy this FinTech snack as well as the next ones. Thank you. Bye-bye.